It started with too much sun. That's what Walter Briggs used to say whenever someone asked him how it all began. Too much sun, and too many oranges going soft, he'd laugh. But back in 1947, there wasn't much to laugh about in the valleys outside Tucson, Arizona. The war was over, the soldiers had come home, and America was learning to breathe again. But Walter's small citrus farm was drowning in its own success. Every week, trucks left his groves carrying crates of oranges to the rail depot, bound for the big cities. But some of them spoiled in the desert heat before they even reached town. Walter hated waste. Sunshine shouldn't rot, he told his wife June. There's gotta be a way to keep it. He'd been an aircraft mechanic during the war, a tinkerer who believed nothing was ever truly broken, only misunderstood. So when his farm hands went home for the evening, Walter stayed in his shed behind the barn, surrounded by the hum of old fans, copper pipes, and bits of scrap metal salvaged from an abandoned airfield. The air smelled like cola and oranges. At first, he tried squeezing the fruit into jars and drying it under a tin roof. That failed. Then he tried baking thin slices in the oven, but June wasn't thrilled when the house filled with smoke and sticky pulp. "You'll burn the place down before you save a single orange," she scolded. But Walter wasn't chasing profit anymore. He was chasing a feeling the way sunlight looked through orange peels when he held them up to the window. A color that felt like summer itself. He wanted to capture that. One night, after weeks of failed experiments, Walter dragged an old dehumidifier from the tool shed and pointed it toward a shallow pan of juice. He left it running overnight, the software of the motor filling the barn like a lullaby. When he returned the next morning, the juice was gone. What was left behind was a thin golden powder that clung to the pan like dessert dust. He scraped it off, stirred it into water, and there it was, the taste of sunshine. June didn't believe him until she tried it herself. "It's sweet," she whispered. "It's real." Word spread faster than wildfire. First the neighbors, then the local grocer, then a food inspector from Phoenix who couldn't stop drinking the stuff. Soon Walter's shed was buzzing with people. Some helping, some watching, everyone tasting. They said he'd invented a miracle. Walter said he'd just bottled sunlight. No one realized it then, but that dusty little barn in the Arizona desert was about to start something that would change how America ate breakfast forever. By the summer of 1948, Walter Briggs's barn no longer smelled like cola and oranges, it smelled like ambition. What began as a quiet experiment had turned into a local sensation. June kept a small ledger by the kitchen window, filled with names of grocers, tourists, and curious scientists who stopped by just to see the orange man from Tucson. Walter didn't charge at first. He said selling it would make it ordinary. "You don't sell sunlight," he told June. "You share it." But the truth was, their little farm was falling behind. Prices for fresh fruit were dropping, and they had a mortgage to pay. So, with a reluctant sigh, Walter filled 10 small jars of the golden powder, hand-labeled each one Sunshine Mix, and brought them to the farmer's market. He sold out before noon. Soon, word reached the city. A businessman from Phoenix, Mr. Carl Whitman, drove down in a black Buick, wearing a hat too sharp for desert heat and a smile that meant paperwork. He watched Walter demonstrate the process, the juicing, the drying, the faint hum of the old dehumidifier, and he said words that made June's heart skip. "Mr. Briggs, you've invented the future." Walter chuckled. "I'm not sure about that. I just didn't want to waste good fruit." But Whitman wasn't joking. He offered Walter a contract to develop the powder for national consumption. He promised factories funding, and even radio ads. For the first time in his life, Walter felt the strange, dizzying pull between invention and ownership. That night, under the Arizona stars, he sat on the back porch with June. The desert wind carried the scent of oranges from the grove. "They'll turn it into something else," he said quietly. "Something I won't recognize." June rested her hand on his shoulder. "Then make sure they remember who started it." The deal went through. By the following spring, trucks rolled out of Tucson loaded with canisters stamped in bright red letters, "Sunshine in a Glass." Radio hosts called it America's breakfast miracle. Housewives poured it into water with a sense of wonder, amazed that something as simple as powder could taste like an orange grove in July. Newspapers called Walter the farmer who defied decay, but success has a way of changing the air on a man. Walter's days were spent in meetings now, far from the hum of his little shed. His hands no longer smelled like citrus, they smelled like ink and paper. One afternoon, a shipment came back from the factory, half the cans spoiled, the powder clumped and bitter. The new machines were faster, hotter, more efficient, but they missed something: the air. The patience, the warmth of the desert sun. When Walter confronted the executives, they shrugged. "It's still drinkable," one of them said. "People won't know the difference." But Walter knew. That night, he went back to the shed, switched on his old dehumidifier, and let the hum fill the silence again. June found him there at dawn, asleep beside the machine, a small pan of powder on the table, bright, golden, perfect. He smiled when he woke. Guess the trick wasn't in the machine after all. June smiled back. No, it was in the man who believed sunshine could be saved, and for a little while longer, before the world claimed his invention. Walter Briggs kept doing what he loved most, bottling sunlight in a dusty Arizona barn. One batch at a time. By 1950, Walter Briggs's name had appeared in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. The man who bottled sunshine. They called him the farmer who captured summer and sold it by the spoonful. His picture hung in grocery stores beside cans of his powdered juice, now rebranded as Golden Sun Mix. But the man himself felt further from sunlight than ever before. The company had moved production east, into factories that ran around the clock. Walter was given a small office in Phoenix, air-conditioned, windowless, filled with paper. His invention had grown faster than he could keep up, and somewhere between the contracts, the advertisements, and the endless approvals, he'd stopped recognizing it. He missed the smell of oranges. He missed the hum of the barn. Most of all, he missed the quiet feeling of doing something good for its own sake, not because it was profitable, but because it made sense. At home, June tried to keep him grounded. She still made breakfast the same way, with eggs, toast, and a small glass of reconstituted sunshine. But Walter could taste the difference now. The new formula was sweet, but empty. Too perfect. Too processed. One morning, he looked at the label and noticed something new, inspired by the work of Walter Briggs. His name was no longer his own. That night, Walter drove out to the old grove. The trees had gone wild, branches twisting in every direction, oranges hanging like forgotten lanterns. The barn was half collapsed, dust thick on the floor. He brushed it away and found his old dehumidifier, the one that had started it all. He plugged it in, it sputtered, coughed, then began to hum. That same low, steady song of invention. He filled a pan with fresh juice. Just like before, the scent filled the air, sharp and alive. When June found him hours later, he was sitting by the machine, eyes tired but content. On the table sat a jar of the old powder, a brighter shade of gold than anything the factory made. He stirred a spoonful into a glass of water, handed it to her, and said quietly, "Taste that." June took a sip and smiled. "That's what it used to be," Walter nodded. "That's what it was meant to be." Word spread not through papers this time, but through people. Neighbors stopped by the old grove to help pick fruit. School teachers brought their students to see the man who caught sunlight. And slowly, the barn became something more than a workspace. It became a gathering place. People didn't come to buy, they came to remember. The air was always filled with laughter, the scent of oranges, and the hum of Walter's faithful machine. One evening, a young boy asked, "Mr. Briggs, how do you trap sunshine?" Walter smiled. "You don't trap it. You just have to listen to it long enough to understand how it wants to stay." The boy didn't understand, not then. But years later, when he became a scientist studying solar energy, he do remember that sentence and the way sunlight looked through the cracks in an old barn roof. Walter never made another deal, never patented another idea. He kept his small grove alive, kept drying juice the old way, and sent jars to schools and hospitals for free. Because to him, the miracle was never the powder, it was the people who believed that sunlight could last. By the time the calendar turned past 1960, the barn had a way of introducing Walter before he ever spoke. The place always met visitors with the same three notes: the faint citrus in the air, the low thrum of the old dehumidifier, and a soft rasp of wind through the elm boards he'd never bothered to seal. People said you could close your eyes and know exactly where you were. Walter liked that. He said some rooms remember you back. He moved slower now. June teased him that he had to tempos, hurry for strangers, and linger for oranges. He still rose before the heat sharpened and walked the grove with a pail and a pocket knife, thumbing fruit to test for weight and sweetness. When his knees complained, he worked sitting on an upturned crate, the way the older mechanics used to when a good fix needed patience more than posture. He taught neighborhood boys how to cut the peels in long spirals and let them dry on twine across the rafters, bright orange garlands swaying above the workbench. The factory drink that had once borrowed his name now came in louder cans with brighter fonts. It showed up at ball games and billboards without ever mentioning the little dessert barn. That stopped bothering him. He'd learned there were two kinds of success: the kind that needs your signature and the kind that needs your steadiness. He had chosen the second on purpose. Schools began writing letters. Could he speak to a class? Could he show the sunshine trick to a room full of kids who'd only met oranges chopped into cafeteria wedges? He always said yes, though he never liked stages. He brought jars and a hand squeezer, asked for 2 volunteers, and let them do the work. The secret, he would say while the room leaned in, is that there isn't one. It's attention, heat that isn't impatient, and air that isn't in a hurry. Teachers wrote thank you notes that smelled faintly of chalk dust. The children sent drawings, yellow suns with his name written in square letters underneath. The first real scare came on a July afternoon when the machine coughed and went silent. Walter stood with his hand on the switch a long time, as if quiet were a language he'd forgotten. He took the cover off, cleaned the grit from the fan blades with a toothbrush, oiled the motor, tightened the belt with the same small wrench he'd carried since the airfield days. When the hum returned lower, wiser, he smiled and said, "You don't fix old things by making them new. You fix them by remembering how they were meant to work." That winter June fell ill for a spell. The house, which had always sounded like to people in conversation, learned to speak in whispers. Walter brought her tea with a slice of peel floating like a small sun, and read her the postcards they'd taped to the pantry door, a science fair ribbon from a boy who'd built a solar cooker, a nurse who wrote that the jars he sent to the clinic made the children think of summer even when they were frightened. On a softer day in March, she walked with him to the barn and rested on the stool near the bench, watching the thin steam rise from a fresh batch. "You always did keep the light," she said. He answered with a nod, because some thanks are too large for language. The last big harvest he supervised himself came the year the new interstate carved a clean line past the town. The exit nobody asked for carried travelers who never planned to stop. Still, a few people found their way to the grove because a custodian at the elementary school had told them about the man who listens to oranges. A family from Ohio stood in the doorway while their daughter cupped both hands around a jelly glass and said it tasted like her grandmother's kitchen on a warm day, which made no sense to anyone but her. Walter told them it made perfect sense, then sent them home with 2 jars and a folded paper of handwritten instructions. He wrote the instructions the way mechanics write diagrams: patient, exact, generous. He warned about heat, which bullies flavor. He circled the line about time, which does its best work when you aren't staring at the clock. He added a note at the bottom that said, "Don't be discouraged by the first bitter batch. Even the dessert has to be learned." When June passed on a mild evening in early spring, Walter worked for 3 days without turning the radio on. He didn't speak much. Grief arranged the barn like a rearranged shelf. You could find everything, but not without touching memory. On the 4th morning, he hung her apron on a nail by the door and left it there. The next visitors would see it and somehow stand quieter. He decided not to explain. The apron did the explaining for him. In the years that followed, the jars he mailed were fewer but traveled farther. A teacher in Vermont wrote that her class had mapped the distance from their snow to his son. A dietitian at a small rural hospital said the taste coaxed appetite back when nothing else could. An engineer once, the boy who'd asked how to trap sunshine, sent a photograph of panels glinting on a school roof and a note, You taught me that sunlight isn't a thing, it's a practice." When Walter finally admitted it was time to let the younger folks lift what his back no longer should, he didn't close the barn. He opened it wider. Saturday mornings became open hours. People brought stubborn toasters, squeaky hinges, and questions. He'd listen first. Then he'd either fix the thing or give them the name of someone who could. "Every good jar of powder," he'd say, "starts with the courtesy of listening." They laughed, thinking he was talking about juice. He wasn't. A local paper came one late autumn to do a human interest piece. The reporter asked for his proudest moment. Walter pointed to the rafters where the peels still dried like ribbons and said, "My proudest moment is that I never learned to hurry." The reporter waited for something quotable. Walter waited with him, which made the sentence quotable after all. The last batch he made alone was on a clear day whose heat never quite committed. He measured slowly, wiped the lip of the pan with a square of muslin June had hemmed, and set the jar bright as a coin on the windowsill. He labeled it in his careful block letters, "Kept, not captured." Then he took out the old wrench from his pocket and laid it beside the machine for the kid who would take his place. He left a note to oil the motor before it asks, "Taste as you go. Remember what you're saving." When he was too tired for ladders but not too tired for watching, the school held Sunshine Day in the grove. Tables under the trees, children moving like bright stitches between shade and light, pictures sweating on checkered cloth. The young man from the Saturday hours now with his own calloused hands and way of listening ran the machine. It hummed like something that had found the pitch of belonging. Walter sat in a wooden chair with a cushion someone's grandmother sewed. They poured him a glass. The color of late afternoon, the rim left a cold ring on his palm. The first sip folded decades into a single taste, June laughing at smoke in the kitchen, the first perfect pan of powder. A radio voice announcing a future that turned out less shiny and more human than promised. A little girl with missing front teeth climbed onto the chair arm and asked the oldest question. "Is this really sunshine?" He looked at her. "It's the part of sunshine that lets you remember it," he answered. She seemed satisfied. Children recognize useful truths when they hear them. That evening, after everyone had gone, and the grove smelled like peel and dust and mild happiness, the younger man walked Walter to the truck. "We can do the heavy work tomorrow," he said. Walter nodded, then looked back at the barn door left open to let the heat out. The apron on the nail moved slightly in the breeze. He lifted two fingers in a small salute that only the boards and the apron nail would understand. He didn't go to the barn the next morning. He sat on the porch with his hat low and his eyes where the trees thinned into sky. The hum of the machine reached him faintly, not with urgency anymore but with a sound like a story continuing without needing his voice on every page. That comforted him. He closed his eyes beside the glass he hadn't finished and let the day take its time. When the town gathered weeks later to name the little dirt road that cut past the grove, they didn't argue long. Somebody suggested Briggs Lane. Somebody else proposed Sunshine Road. The sign they finally bolted to the post said both. Children pointed when the bus turned there, and a few of them, without knowing why, felt braver on spelling tests. Years after that, long after the last harvest had been pressed into powder by hands that never met the man who first listened to oranges, new parents would stop at the fence and tell their kids that someone once figured out how not to waste what was good. The children would nod, because the idea felt like common sense. Which was the point all along. If you stand in the barn on a dry afternoon and close your eyes, the air still tastes like a warm idea. The old machine hums with its careful note on the sill. A jar catches whatever light the day can spare. The label has faded, but you can still make out the letters if the sun is kind. Kept, not captured. And if you listen past the motor, past the rustle of leaves and the steady work of a place that outlived its inventor, you can hear the translation Walter left for anyone who needs it. You cannot hold on to sunshine. You can only keep making ways for it to stay. Sometimes, the brightest stories aren't about inventions or fame, they're about people who refuse to let goodness fade. Walter Briggs never set out to change the world. He just wanted to keep something beautiful from being wasted. And maybe that's what truly matters, not how many people remember your name, but how many lives carry a little of your light forward. If this story touched you, take a moment to share it. Leave a comment about something you think the world has forgotten but deserves to be remembered. And if you love stories like this, quiet, human, full of warmth and memory, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because here, we keep the light alive, one story at a time.